Good morning, everybody. My name is Ellen Aronson, and I'm the chair of the Docent Council. And I would just like to thank the Schoofs and Lapanis family for this fabulous event. I think it's become very special for all of us. And in fact, even today, I have someone who said to me, I'd like to do it next year. I'd like to be the speaker next year. So I think it's really terrific. There are several of you in the audience today that did not know Therese Schoofs. You're new docent trainees, some storytellers are here. And I think it's really important to keep the memory of this wonderful docent alive, because it's not only a celebration of Therese, it's a celebration of all of us as docents and what we do here. So Therese, and you'll get a kick out of this, some of you, was a docent for more than 20 years. I wonder how many of us are moving very close to that number. She also was the head of the Community Speakers Bureau for about 4 or 5 years. And my experience of knowing Therese when I was starting as a docent was her talk on jewelry, which I just thought was absolutely fantastic. But I wanted to bring up someone who knew Therese very well and is also, lucky for us, giving our talk today, David Buchanan. So he's going to tell you give a few words about Therese before he begins.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's very difficult to get up here and tell a few words about Therese, because when you've known a person for so long and worked with them so closely, you think, well, I can just tell stories off the top of my head, but they're not always appropriate to the audience involved. And actually, my best story about Therese was the one that I told just 2 years ago when I gave a talk here. And that story had to do with the novel Genji. And since many of you were not here at that time, and most of you who were here have forgotten what I said at that time, anyway, I will just tell that story again. We had a person named Thomas Hare, who was a great lecturer, and he came from Stanford, came up here and he gave one of the best talks on the novel Genji that we had ever heard. And after Thomas Hare's talk, Therese and my wife Margot and I were walking from the auditorium to the docent office, and the two girls were saying, "Oh, wasn't that wonderful? Oh." And I said, "Yeah, it was." And so they began to describe the novel Genji as a lyrical love story. Let me tell you guys and girls, that wasn't the way I saw it at all. I didn't see any lyrical love story there. I saw a guy who was fixated on his mother and then fixated on his father's wife. And, well, if you've read the Genji, I'd read the Genji by now in 5 different translations, and I've never been able to get the lyrical love story in it. But anyway, so you know how it is when you've got one guy and a gaggle of women, they don't pay any attention to what you say. And they kept saying, "Oh, wasn't it wonderful? It was a lyrical love story." And I kept saying this guy had an Oedipus complex. So that was the way I got interested in giving my talk on the Genji 2 years ago. And I, at that time, got together a committee of psychiatrists and psychologists and told them about the story Genji. And the psychiatrist said, "Well, how do you feel about that, Dave?" And one lady was the retired professor of psychology at Berkeley, and she said, "I think you do need a few more references." And 2 of them were practicing psychologists, and they said, "Sure, he had Oedipus complex, and go ahead and say it." So that's how we got the Genji, and that's how Therese was instrumental in my thinking about the Genji. Therese was very organized. I'm very disorganized. And as an example of that, and this is the last anecdote, guys, girls, Therese and I were in the galleries one time, and we were looking at some objects, and I don't have the slightest memory now what objects we were looking at, and I was saying in my usual flippity jib and excited way, "Oh, isn't that wonderful?" Finally I said, "I just love these objects." And Therese said to me, "I love the Asian Art Museum." And I thought, well, there's a difference. I love various unclassified, otherwise, objects, and she is more organized and loves the entire Asian Art Museum. So, to get down to the talk at hand, a little more than a year ago, during the early part of the Year of the Dragon, I happened to be standing over in the Imperial Chinese Gallery, not looking at dragons, but looking at rhinoceros horn cups. It was the first time we had ever had all the rhinoceros horn cups out together. We'd frequently had a rhinoceros horn cup or two on display, and I'd never paid that much attention to them, but when Michael Knight and Lee put them all together, it made such an impact on me that I just was standing there entranced by them when up walked our friend Forrest. And I said to Forrest, "I've been preparing a docent talk on the Year of the Dragon, but I would really rather give one on these rhinoceros horn cups." And he said, "Why don't you do it on both of them?" And I said, "How could you tie them together?" And he said, "Well, the hook is," that hitches them together, "the hook is that they were both used in traditional medicine." So I thought, this is a way to give a talk on the Year of the Dragon and also on rhinoceros horn cups and join it together by the Year of the Dragon and the rhinoceros horn both being used in traditional medicine. And I selected the FDA as a metaphor for scientific medicine and decided to compare the use of dragon bones and the use of rhinoceros horns in traditional medicine and compare it with just a little bit with scientific medicine. And so we're off and running. And I began to pick out notable things that had either dragons or rhinoceroses. And so when I began to look through the museum, one of the first things I saw that had dragons on it was one of my favorite pieces, and it's a large vase. This thing is about 12¼ inches tall and 12¼ inches wide. And it's made of a type of porcelain called Qingbai. Well, Qingbai was not exactly the first porcelain ever made in China, but it was very early on, and it was quite different from porcelain as we know porcelain today, because Qingbai was made out of something called China stone. And they mined this China stone, and most of it, not all of it, but most of it came from a place called Jingdezhen. Well, Jingdezhen is an interesting place in itself, and you may wonder how it got that funny name. Jingdezhen was started during the reign of the Emperor Jingde in the early part of the 12th century. So Jingdezhen was the place where they found all kinds of China stone, and they used China stone to make porcelain. China stone is very different from kaolin. That's the first thing you have to know. So they mined this China stone and they made porcelain, and they could make these big things, 12¼ inches tall at that time. And as they mined it and mined it and mined it there at Jingdezhen, the pieces got flabbier and flabbier and flabbier. And they didn't know why, until somebody figured out that at the top surface of the China stone deposit that they were mining, it had been rained on for millions of years. And the rain had washed away certain ingredients in the China stone. You may not be interested in this, but it's relevant. Now, China stone consists largely of calcium, sodium, and potassium silicates. And sodium and potassium silicates have greater solubility than the calcium silicates. So as it rained on the China stone deposit, it washed away a lot of the more soluble elements, and it turned out that those were the things that gave it strength. And later on, as they made more and more Qingbai and used more and more of the China stone, they got to where they couldn't make these big things. Well, we talked about Emperor Jing De, who was about the 5th or 6th emperor of the northern Sung dynasty. As things happen in China, always have, probably always will, there was a change in dynasty, because in 1220, a really belligerent fellow came down from out of Central Asia, and his name was Genghis Khan. And he began to attack China, but in about 1220. In about 1227, a funny thing happened on the way to the forum. Genghis Khan died. Well, the Mongols went home back to Mongolia to select a new leader, and then they came back and finished conquering China, and it wasn't until about 1278 that they finished it and established a new dynasty, the Yuan dynasty, and it was in the fairly early part of the Yuan dynasty that this piece was made. And at that time, the Qingbai porcelain being made at Jingdezhen was still quite strong, and they could make these big pieces. But it got to where they couldn't, and this led to other things, and I won't tell you exactly what happened yet, because it has to do with the history of porcelain, and we're not here to talk about the history of porcelain. We're here to talk about dragons and rhinoceroses. So I want you to look at this thing, and scratched into the clay was this wonderful meandering dragon with a 3 or 4 clawed paw, and I just think that is a wonderful dragon, and it epitomizes the dragons and the porcelain of the Yuan dynasty. Well, in 1368, things began to change. There was a horrible guy, probably not as bad as Genghis Khan, but close, and his name was Zhu Yuanzhang, and he conquered China. He drove the Mongols back into the desert where they belong, and he started the new dynasty. Now, if you're a great warlord and have become a great general and have become a lousy emperor, you can't reign under the name Zhu Yuanzhang. That doesn't go. You have to have a reign name. So he picked the reign name Hung Wu. So he is known as the Hung Wu Emperor. Now, the word Hung Wu is interesting because the first syllable means great and powerful and extensive and all-encompassing. But since Chinese is a monosyllabic language, and they only have a limited number of phonemes that the human voice can make, all of these syllables have many different words attached to them. So the word hung not only means vast and powerful, it also means red, and it means a particular red, a carmine red. And so, since his reign name was Hung Wu, red became very important to the emperor. Well, his family name was Zhu, and Zhu has, among its other meanings, it also means red. It means sort of cinnabar red. So here's a guy that's a real red. Not quite as red as some of the reds in red China today, but for the time, very red. So red became important, and there are many anecdotes concerning the color red in China of the Ming Dynasty, but we won't tell them now. Now, this is a large piece. It is beautifully potted, and it is colored with copper. There are only 3 coloring agents that will stand up to being heated to 1280 or so degrees Celsius, which is what you have to heat this kind of porcelain. And one of them is copper. The other 2 are cobalt and iron, which we will show you in a minute. Well, cobalt is easy and iron not quite so, but copper is very difficult because it migrates through the glaze. As you can see, it runs. And the other thing that it does is, if it is baked in the almost perfect absence of oxygen, it turns this lovely carmine red. If there is just an absolutely smidgen of oxygen, it turns sort of brown. And most pieces in most museums that have underglazed copper it's really not this carmine red, it's really more of a brown. In fact, there are only two pieces like this with underglazed copper and of this size and of this wonderful shape, two pieces in all the world. One of them is in the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. It is a piece that I love, and it is in a museum that Terry loved. And the other one is in the Shanghai Museum, so we're in very good company there. Cobalt. Cobalt, of course, was the great coloring agent for underglazed Chinese wares, and they began to do it, and they did it better than anybody ever had. And a funny thing happened, because in the year 1426, they had a new emperor in China, the Xuan emperor, and of course the king of Korea sent tribute to the Xuan emperor, and the Xuan emperor in return sent him a lovely blue and white vase. And it was the first time the Koreans had ever had such a wonderful blue and white piece. The Koreans could make porcelain. They're the only people in the world beside the Chinese who could make porcelain at that time and for the next 100 years almost. And so the Koreans took it as sort of a challenge that he sent them this wonderful porcelain piece that he thought was beyond their capacity to make. And Koreans are never one to pass up a challenge, so they got right to work and they began to make blue and white porcelain, and they made this beautiful piece, which has ended up in the Asian Art Museum with this beautiful dragon. Now that is a dragon to conjure with. There are several registers on this vase, and he is just fighting his way out of the central register. His paw just reaches over, he's expanding he's got one paw up in the air waving at you. He has a smile on his face. You would never see this on a Chinese piece. No real collector or curator would ever mistake this dragon for a Chinese dragon, because in some way he just looks Korean. The other thing is, of course, a little oxygen has leaked into the kiln, and so some of the iron in the glaze has turned to ferric iron, which is red, and that would never have been tolerated in China. So we know that's a Korean piece, but it's a great Korean piece, and it's a great Korean dragon. Here's another Korean dragon, because this is the third coloring agent that you can use for underglaze porcelain, and it's iron. So if iron is baked in the absence of oxygen, it turns black or brown. If it's baked in the presence of oxygen, of course, it's ferric oxide and is red like rust, which is what it is. So here's another Korean dragon. So we can see that it is the year of the dragon. They're celebrating the dragon in China and in San Francisco, but they're also celebrating it in Korea and even in Japan, because this is a 6-panel Japanese screen showing the dragon coming right down out of the clouds and bringing rain. The dragon in Asian culture is not a bad creature like St. George going out there breathing fire on people, killing people. That's not it at all. The dragon brings the rain. And just to prove that, if you think back, this year is the year of the dragon. Has been since last February, will be until February the 6th. And this year we had an autumn which had one characteristic: plenty of rain. So the dragon brought us the rain. Very good animal. We love the dragon. Here is a dragon to conjure with. This is one of the great signature pieces of the Shang Dynasty. Now, the Shang Dynasty in China was from about 1500 to about 1042 or maybe 1040. Some people pick September 3rd, 1042 at 10 a.m., but you don't have to get that precise. Okay. So this is a piece from the Shang Dynasty, and it is decorated with these wonderful dragons that are cast into the piece. This is a huge piece. The first time I saw this piece, I said to the curator, "Oh, this is a wonderful piece. Oh, I love this piece. I've never seen a better piece like this, except one in the Neizu Museum in Tokyo." And she looked at me disdainfully and said, "David, that piece is not better than our piece. As a matter of fact, they're one of a pair. They're exactly alike." So that goes to show what your memory will do to you. Now, how do dragon bones come into the picture. If a person wanted to communicate with his ancestors, he put a wonderful bronze piece on the altar and had ceremonies putting food and wine in these great bronze vessels, and the food and wine rose up to Shangdi, the great spirit, and the ancestors. But if he really wanted to talk to the spirits, he couldn't do that. He used dragon bones. Now, dragon bones were somewhat hard to come by in ancient China. And they used two things as dragon bones. They used, first of all, the scapula of a cow, or the plastron, the anterior shell of a turtle. And this happens to be the plastron of a turtle. And the way it went was the king or the duke or Lady Fu Hao or somebody just as important posed a question. And the question was phrased as the king should or the king should not attack the Xiongnu. That was actually one of them. The king proposed we should attack the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu were a tribe of semi-Mongol nomads that lived just on the other side of the border, and had fast horses, and they were pretty tough. And so the king said we should or should not attack the Xiongnu. So they got a dragon bone, and they took a hot piece of bronze and they put it on the dragon bone until it cracked. And then the soothsayer, the shaman, looked at the cracks and he decided what they meant. And in this case, he said, the Xiongnu have fast horses and they're very militarily skillful. Let's not attack them. Turned out to be a good decision. This is another one. This is part of the scapula of a cow, and it has these wonderful Chinese ideograms on it. Now, in the late 19th century, there was a scholar in the city of Anyang, and he went into a pharmacy, and he found the pharmacist busily grinding up dragon bones to make medicines. And he looked at some of these dragon bones, and he found out that being a scholar, he could read them, and he found out that he was looking at the archives of the ancient Shang Dynasty, and much of what we know today comes from reading these dragon bones. Well, being a scholar and being very powerful in the government, he got to work, and he managed to get them to pretty much stop grinding up antique bones from the Shang Dynasty to make medicines, although it is still done occasionally today if they can get their hands on one. But this brings us to traditional medicine. Now, traditional medicine exists in all cultures, and since I want to talk about it just generically and not particularly about China, Japan, and Korea, I'm going to talk about England. To be in England now that April's there. Now, what does this have to do with traditional medicine? It's just, this is Digitalis purpura, the purple foxglove. And it turned out that it's quite poisonous, or it is reputed to be quite poisonous. But I was reading something about poisons the other day, and it said, there are no poisons. There are just excessive doses. Because if you take the foxglove leaf and give it in a smaller and smaller dose, you find out that it's actually helpful. Well, in the 18th century, there was a gentleman who had graduated from the University of Edinburgh, which was the Johns Hopkins of that time and area, and he had gone down to Shropshire and was practicing medicine there. But being a graduate of this distinguished university, he was quite curious and intellectually active, and he saw that a lady who was an herbal specialist living out in the country was getting better results with congestive heart failure than he and all the other professors of medicine were. And he went out and he got some of her herbs, and he brought them back, and he found out what was in them, and he tested it one by one, and he found out that the active principle that was helping the shortness of breath and the flushed face and the cyanotic lips and the rapid pulse and the funny-looking ears, etc., was something called Digitalis purpura. And he found out that he had always thought that this was poison, but if you gave it in small enough dose, it wasn't poison, and it helped your patients with congestive heart failure, so he wrote a poem about it. And the poem went, "The foxglove's leaf, with caution given, another proof of favoring heaven. The hectic flush it can abate, the rapid pulse may moderate, and grace to him whose will is fate may give a lengthened day." So this brings us up to the consideration of what is traditional medicine and what is scientific medicine. And there is a simple definition that I would like to propose. You don't have to accept it. And the definition is, if there's any evidence that it's helpful, and that evidence is substantiated, and if it's not so toxic that it kills you out of hand, if there's any evidence, then it is scientific medicine. If there is no evidence that it does any good or it kills you, then it is traditional medicine. So if you keep that in mind, it'll help you deal with the latest traditional remedies, which you will see advertised in the health food store. Enough about dragons. Let's go on to the rhinoceros. Now, this rhinoceros has, for several generations now, been sort of one of the most beloved pieces in this museum. I love this piece. A wonderful rhinoceros, not without controversy. When this piece was excavated in the 1840s in Shandong province, the home of Confucius, and actually probably had been at one time in the family of Confucius, everybody looked at it and said, "Oh, this is not a Ming Dynasty piece," because remember the great big thing that we showed from here in the Neizu Museum in Tokyo? Ming Dynasty pieces look like that. They're covered with dragons and patterns all over. And look how plain this is, how simple, what a personality he has, how he looks at you with these little eyes. And when they looked inside, they saw this wonderful inscription, a whole lot of characters in there, and they got a scholar who could read that, and he puzzled it all out. And it said, when the king came to visit Ancestor Yu, who was a big man in the local area, Ancestor Yu helped him in fighting the next tribe, not the Xiang. And as a result, in gratitude, the king promoted Ancestor Yu to be in charge of the city and also gave him several strings of cowrie shells. Now, cowrie shells were the currency of the time. Obviously, they were having a little financial problem there, and the king wanted to inflate the currency. It was like the present thing of the quantitative easing. So the king put more cowrie shells into circulation, and Ancestor Yu did just the right thing with them. He had this piece cast, which was to bring good fortune to himself and his family through multiple generations. So here we are in the rhinoceros kingdom, and let's look at some of the rhinoceros cups. This is one of my favorites. I'll look at the number, B65M21, for those of you who want to look it up. Now, if you look at this cup carefully, you will see that it has various blossoms, some kind of prunus blossom, a plum or an apricot. It has a deer. Down here it has rocks and waves crashing on the shore and flowers. And if you look at the other side of it, you will see that it has a crane, and here's another crane standing on the rocks, and here's a camellia. Now, in Chinese culture, there are a multiplicity of 4-word or 4-syllable sayings. And there's a saying for everything. If you drop a bowl and break it on the floor, your mother says, so I don't speak any Chinese, so I'll spare you trying it, but one of these 4-syllable sayings which bring good fortune and good luck. And if you are a scholar and are trying to outfit your desk, and you are going to have a rhinoceros horn cup carved anyway, you have it beautifully carved with these symbols of good fortune and good luck. And the saying on this one is, quotes, "A mountain of longevity and a sea of blessing. Well, that's the only one I've looked up, so I won't trouble you with any more of them, but they all are very similar. Now, this one is aquatic plants, and the cup itself is a lotus blossom, and here are the lotus leaves and the lotus seed pod. Now, I've put this thing into iPhoto, and I've gussied up the color a little bit. Actually, I did the first piece a little bit, too. So you can see it better. It's not really this bright. But anyway, so you all know about the lotus, how it springs up out of the mud of this, the dirt and mud and water of ordinary life, and blooms with a beautiful white and pink blossom. And it's very important in Buddhism, also in Hinduism and various other things. So it has great significance. This is another rhinoceros horn cup with a deer motif. The deer motif was very popular up along the northwest frontier, where the army was for most of their lives fighting the nomads, and that was something they would have liked. Here is one to conjure with. This, in the 12th century, there was a great scholar and poet named Su Dong Po, and almost all of you, except Terry's family, the Schoofs and the Deponeses, I bet they never heard of Su Dong Po, but all the docents have. So Su Dong Po was a great scholar and a great courtier in the northern Ming Dynasty, and in the first part of the 12th century, he did something wrong. I'm not sure exactly what. He got himself exiled. So he was sent to South China. When he got to South China, along the banks of the Yangtze River, he found a place called the Red Cliff. Now, here, there was a fort there. So here's the fortification of the Red Cliff. Here are the pine trees hanging on to the cliff, and this is the cliff itself. And Su Dong Po sat right down and wrote an essay that was so important that it is still studied to this day. Something happened going the wrong way here. And this is the other side of the cup, and it shows, here's the cliff, here's the Yangtze River. Here are the two scholars, Su Dong Po and his friend, in a boat. Here are two oarsmen, and back there, if you can look at it closely, there's a small lad who has a charcoal stove on the back of the boat. He's making tea for the scholars, and they're floating down under the Red Cliff looking. So this was something that a scholar would like to have, because not only did it have various symbols of longevity and good luck, but it also called to mind the great essay of Su Dong Po about the Red Cliff. Now, that essay told the story of a general from the north. Northern generals didn't do very well in China, just like the Civil War here. It took a lot of time for the northern generals to catch on. But this general from the north was named Cao Cao, and he went down to South China to pacify some rebellious tribes, and in the year AD 208, he was roundly defeated at the Red Cliff. Now, this had tremendous results. First of all, it was the straw that broke the camel's back. The Han Dynasty had existed from 210 BCE to, at that time, 208 of the Common Era, and it was getting pretty old and decrepit anyway, and that classic defeat, that military blunder by Cao Cao, resulted in the Chinese army being routed, and it resulted in the year 221 in the Han Dynasty falling. This was one of the great tragedies to ever befall mankind, because the Toba Turks swept in from the hinterland and took over, and North China broke into 6 different kingdoms, and 6 different kingdoms just can't manage the economy and the infrastructure. And one of the things that happened was that the Turks did not maintain the dikes on the Yellow River. And when the Yellow River had its next flood, it flooded about 1,000 square miles of North China and literally killed several million people. So this was a disaster of epic proportion, and the Red Cliff came to illustrate in Chinese thinking the fall of the Han Dynasty and all of the bad things that happened after that. So this is the kind of cup that if you were a scholar, you would love to have on your desk. This is another cup showing the Western paradise of Xiang Mu. And since time is getting short and we don't want to miss our lunch, although the pastries were very good, I won't tell you all about the Western Paradise and the peach trees that grow there and the birthday party that happens once every 5,000 years, but it's a cup that would have reminded the scholar of all those wonderful stories. And here's another one. If you look at any collection of Chinese paintings, you will see numerous paintings of travelers in the mountains. So here's a traveler in the mountains, and he's going across a narrow wooden bridge across a rushing stream. And there is a story connected with this, but fortunately for you, I didn't look it up, so we won't have to stop and tell that one. Well, not only did they have auspicious meanings in their cups and wonderful stories, but they also like to emulate classic pieces of long ago. So this is just a piece in the style of the Ming Dynasty, but carved in the Qing Dynasty, and not in bronze, but in rhinoceros horn. And here's another one, very similar, with dragons crawling up and over it. And why would the dragons want to do that? Whoops, missed it. I've lightened this color. This is not the real color. Here are the juvenile dragons crawling up and going in. Why did they want to do that? What is magical about a rhinoceros horn cup? Well, as everybody knows, rhinoceros horn will neutralize poisons. But I've told you there is no poison. There are just traditional remedies given in excessive doses. So if it just neutralizes a part of the poison, it will not kill you. It may actually be good for you. And in the old days, when Chinese gentlemen, it was not unusual to have several wives, and when you have several wives, you have discord in the family, and your third wife, who is a cute little Chinese lady, and believe me, there are lots of cute little Chinese ladies, she is apt to, one morning, put a little arsenic in your rice wine, and that's the way they solve family problems. But if you are a smart gentleman and you have a rhinoceros horn cup, when she serves you the rice wine with just a smidge of arsenic in it, the rhinoceros horn will neutralize it, and you will live happily ever after. This is another one with a better story, and I'm going to tell this story, although I will shorten it just a little bit. This is on display, and it's a water dropper in the shape of, here's a dragon with a dropper here, and here is a wonderful old gentleman, and his name is Zhang Qian, and he was a general in the Chinese army. Well, I don't have to tell you about this, but for the Schoofs and Deponuses, don't forget that the terracotta warriors, showing the generals, just like General Zhang Qian, are going to be here on George Washington's birthday, February 26th. Don't come that first week. You won't be able to get in. Very crowded. Come about the third week. Okay, so Zhang Qian was a general in the army. There was a great emperor named Wu Di. Han Wu Di was very disturbed about the Xiongnu because after all this, almost 2,000 years, the Xiongnu were still out there just on the other side of the Great Wall, and they were still causing all sorts of trouble. And he got a good idea because he had read von Clausewitz and Sun Tzu on war, and he was a great strategist. And he called General Zhang Qian to meet him at the Mogao Caves at Dongwang, and they met there, and Wu Di said to the general, I want you to make your way through the territory of the Xiongnu and get to the Yuezhe tribe on the other side and make a treaty with them, because if they will attack from the west and we attack from the east, we can wind up the Xiongnu in no time at all. So he sent Qian Zhang off into the desert, and there he is leaving Dongwang out into the desert. Well, of course, the Xiongnu were no beginners. They knew what the game was, and as soon as he set foot in their territory, they nabbed him. This is what he was going to do. He was going to go clear through the Xiongnu territory out north of the Great Desert, get out to Bactria, and then come back. And this is the Silk Route. The one in red is the Silk Road showing. Well, as soon as he got out there, they captured him. They made him a goat herder. They kept him there for 10 years. They did not treat him well. They did not really care for him. He finally escaped. He did get to the USA, and they told him, treaty, we're not going to sign a treaty with you guys. We're actually going to go out and conquer India. And they did. And he came back to China, and he didn't bring the treaty, but he did bring wonderful horses, the great Arabian-type horses from Fergana that were unlike any horses that the Chinese had. If you're going to have horses, you got to have alfalfa. Horses are funny that way. So he brought alfalfa with him, and he also brought grapes. They had always had rice wine. Rice wine has a strong taste. It's easy to put a little arsenic in it. Grapes, much better. He brought grapes, and here's a jug of grape juice. And so he was a great man and was revered. And one day when he was very old, he said, it is my time to join the immortals. And he said to his assistants, make me a boat. So they took an aged antique grapevine and they carved it in the shape of a boat. And they loaded him with all kinds of supplies. And they put it in the Yellow River to float downstream into the Yellow Sea and maybe even over to Korea. But a funny thing happened. It did not float downstream. It began to float upstream, counter current. It did. Where's Joe? Don't look at me like that, Joe. I know you're doubting this. It floated upstream, clear up into the Milky Way, and Xian is at present one of the immortals in the Milky Way. And if it weren't cloudy tonight, you would be able to see him, but unfortunately, probably not. Well, we've talked about dragons on a number of different media, everything from rhinoceros horn cups to ancient bronzes and porcelains, but we mustn't neglect textiles. Actually, Avery Brundage did neglect textiles, so we don't have many of them in the museum, not like bronzes and porcelains. Recently, a lady named Jackie Deetkin, who was married to a guy named Mackey, but she does not want to be called Jackie Mackey. She prefers to be called Jackie Deetkin, so that's what we're going to call her. And she came to me and said, my great-grandfather was in China in 1890, and the Dowager Empress Cixi, he was presented at court to her, and at that time they gave him a complete outfit of kimono and collar and cuffs and boots and a hat and the whole shebang, and he was presented at court. And don't you think this is a wonderful thing? And I said, you know what you ought to do? You ought to give that to the Asian Art Museum. And she said, okay. So we came down here, and the curators looked at it, and they pondered over it, and they got great consultants to consult with it. And they found a few insects in it, and that caused a lot of excitement. But they finally decided to take it. So we have one more beautiful piece of textile, which has not yet been on view, but someday will be. And I hope that you all get to see it, because the best textile in this museum, in my humble opinion, is this one. In about 1990, when Therese and Margot and I and several other people here, where's Alice, were all docents, that was long before Stephanie and you younger people showed up. This came on the market. It was in some gentleman in Western England had turned up the bottom of it and made a jacket to wear to the opera. But he finally decided to sell it, and Pat Berger was the curator here at the time, and she just went wild over this thing. She thought this was the best textile, and I did too. And she scurried around, and we finally got the money and bought that thing because it looked like it was from the Ming Dynasty, and we didn't have much of any textiles from the Ming Dynasty. It looked like it was from the reign of the Emperor Wan Li. Well, most of you realize that Wan Li ruled from 1573 to 1619. So it was a very important period in Chinese history. It was just 20 years before the Ming Dynasty fell. And Wan Li was a very peculiar emperor, and if this was indeed in his reign, this would be an important thing. In addition to which, it just in itself, with the good luck symbols, the swastika up here and the longevity thing, and the two dragons with spiky whiskers and white horns and multicolored abdomens, and here are the waves breaking on the rocks of the shore and the dragons springing up out of the waves, and here are the clouds which are shaped like magic mushrooms, and here the dragon has within his jaws the pearl of potentiality. Now you know that the dragon chases a pearl, and if you catch the pearl, it gives you everything that you could possibly want. And these dragons have caught the pearl, so that whoever owned this coat had achieved success beyond her wildest dreams. It turned out that Pat Berger looked inside the collar and she found a date there, and it was the 5th day of December, 1595. And she said she just happened to know that this was 3 days before the birthday of the Dowager Empress. And she said, who else? Obviously, this thing had to be for somebody in the imperial household, and she is convinced that that is who it's from, the Dowager Empress. Well, what do we know about the Dowager Empress? She was the mother of Wan Li. He came to the throne in 1573 when he was about 10 years old. Of course, his mother and the prime minister, who were good friends, and I want to tell you, they were really good friends. And they cooperated to manage the country. And Wan Li, being a 10-year-old kid, didn't have much to do, and he didn't do anything much. But finally, in 1592, Wan Li asserted himself for the first and only time. Now, years ago, when I was in Korea with the United States Army, I had to deal a lot with a lot of Korean officers, and one day, seeking to learn a little bit more about history, I mentioned Wan Li and that he was the poster child for the bad emperor syndrome. And they told me, oh no, actually he was a good emperor, because in 1592, when the Japanese tyrant Hideyoshi attacked Korea, Wan Li bestirred himself and came down and said to his mother and the prime minister, we've got to help the Koreans. And they did, and they helped them, and they defeated Hideyoshi and the Japanese army with the help of Admiral Kim, but we won't tell that story. And so that they have an opinion of Wan Li that is much higher than the opinion that we have always had of him. But it doesn't matter, because he had a cute little mother who was friends with the prime minister, and she had the outer robe. And as Pat Berger researched it more, she discovered that this was not her outer robe. She wore a yellow robe over this. This was her inner robe. And this is the way the back looked. No, that's still the front. No, wait a minute, that is the back. Okay, the dragons no longer have the pearl of potentiality in their tooth, but they still do have the 2 swastikas, etc. And this is the side panel. It shows you the beautiful way the abdomen of the dragon and his spiny back and his spiky mustache and his horns and his sharp teeth. Just wonderful embroidery. I could go on for a little bit more about how this is made. A multiplicity of different kinds of stitches there. And these are the side panels. Here again, he's still chasing the pearl of potentiality. This is the sleeve. And so we're going to say goodbye to this dragon, but you will have to admit that this is the fanciest piece of underwear that you ever saw in your life. So we're about through. Let me check the time. What time is it? Anybody have the time? Yeah, I should have closed about 3 minutes ago. Okay, let's just talk a little bit about dragons and, rhinoceros and other cultures. The Chinese were not the only ones that tried to kill off every dragon. They wiped out all the dragons in China. They wiped out all the dragons in Vietnam, and almost all the dragons, the rhinoceroses in Laos and Cambodia, and practically every last dragon in Sumatra. And they were hard at work buying all the rhinoceros horns from Africa. The northwestern species of black rhino was declared extinct last year. There is a big movement in China, as there is here, to make them stop using the rhinoceros horn in their traditional medicine. But if you are terminally ill and the traditional doctor says to you, rhinoceros horn will help, you may have been to Beijing University and done master's degrees at Berkeley, but you say to yourself, well, it can't hurt, so let's try it. And so they're still using a little rhinoceros horn in medicine. But at least the people in the Arab lands have stopped using rhinoceros horns for their dagger handles. They're doing things in South Africa to try to preserve the rhinoceros horn, such as sawing off the horn. 2 or 3 strong men, I guess, hold the rhinoceros, and somebody saws off the horn. I don't think I want to try that. But in any event, what we have done is to review various objects in the museum that have either some connection with rhinoceroses or with dragons. And we have reviewed the various media on which these objects were made. And we've reviewed some of the stories about some of the pieces, because almost every one of these pieces has a story attached. And we've looked at what is just perhaps my favorite, personal favorite piece. We're not supposed to have favorite pieces, but you know I love pieces. And this Korean vase with the smiling dragon waving at you and saying, as a good Korean would, "Annyeong hikashipsio," meaning may your departure be peaceful, because this is where we're going to leave it. Because the fact is that I love these pieces, and Therese Schoofs loved the Asian Art Museum. And after she said that to me, I realized that I too loved the Asian Art Museum. And I'll tell you one thing for sure, the Asian Art Museum loved Terry. So thank you for coming, and annyeong.